Hello and welcome to another instalment of our occasional podcast called I Wish I Hadn't. I'm Dave Hill.
And I'm John Wyatt. As you can tell from our names, David and Jonathan, we were born in the 1950s, so we've had many years to accumulate embarrassing moments which we now feel happy to share.
The dictionary defines regret as a sorrowful remembrance, a sense of loss. But we're not in the business of sorrow and loss here. We're dealing with those things in life that we might wish had been otherwise, but which we're now prepared to own up to. Well, here we are again, funnily enough, talking about education still. We've done 3 podcasts on education with primary and 2 secondaries, and having discussed it together, we thought, well, there's a bit missing, because we did a podcast on career. We maybe ought to cover the years at which we were in further education at our various colleges and universities and polytechnics.
We were the elite.
We certainly were.
We were chosen, to go under higher education. Now, I know that you said that you had already got a place at teacher training.
I had, yes. I was actually just going to mention that. The fact that having already got a place, I did bugger about a bit when it came to A-levels. Didn't do as well as I should have done, knowing that I was about to go off to teacher training college, which I did, and it was the start of 3 years of a variety of things,
But for me, of course, I had got my A levels. They weren't great; they were okay, and I had already gone through applications to universities. Hadn't been offered anything. I'd gone through the clearing system, which sounds like a sort of an enema or something, but
or something to do with your throat, doesn't it? Really?
Something to do with your throat.
The phlegm system.
But neither the enema nor the clearing of the throat produced anything for me. So I was kind of at home. I didn't seem to be particularly concerned about this, but I thought, I wanted to go into further education, and I hadn't thought of anywhere particularly to apply, but then I thought, well, I better knuckle down, and so I applied for 2 polytechnics, and I was offered an interview at the first one, so I went up to London. It was Middlesex Polytechnic, and I had an interview, and it was really quite strict. I was interviewed. I was sitting opposite about 4 people, and they asked me some quite stringent questions, which I didn't answer particularly well, and I went home thinking, well, I've blown that one. And
that's
then
good way of getting in, actually. You said I've blown that one.
Well, yeah, but there were 4 of them. I'm not sure I had that much energy. But then I offered another one at the college that I went to, which was in London, central London. And I went up for the interview for that one, and I was driven up by my dad, and I had an interview, a very brief interview with just one person. And at the end of the interview, I said, when will I know whether I've got in? And this woman said, "You're in." This was a Thursday. She said, "Can you start on Monday?"
Wow.
So I said, "Yeah, that seems okay." So we went home. And I packed a case and sorted everything out, and went back on Monday to start. But of course, one other thing before I forget that is that I had to find accommodation.
Of course,
and I went to the accommodation officer. And he said, "You'll be lucky," because Central London was not easy to find a place. And he said, "Well, there's a bed and breakfast place you can go to."
Oh, right, okay.
And so I went round there and met a gentleman called Mr. Kidway, and I was signed up. I think it cost about £6 a week or something like that, which was bed and breakfast. It wasn't, to this, I knew this was a part-time thing, but I had accommodation. So
you were able to actually get started, weren't you?
So more to follow on that. So what happened when you went up?
Well, I was my dad drove me up in light blue minivan,
Mm.
and I was dropped off and put my stuff into the bottom double room of a hall of residence, which had been an isolation hospital.
What, you had to share with someone?
I had to share with someone who I
Oh.
didn't know at all.
Right.
And this person,
Girl or
it was no, it was a boy. It was a boys residence.
Unlucky.
The hall there, and no, it was all very much the accommodation was all single sex.
How was it?
And
Right.
I'd never, I was there for probably, in fact, the first night I was there on my own, because I was actually taken up the night before the official start. Don't remember people were arriving. I think it was a Saturday, I think it was, and people were supposed to arrive on the Sunday, but because of various things, that's the only time Dad could take me up. Dropped me off with my rucksack, a few records, clothes, that sort of thing. Very little stuff at the time. And I sort of got myself settled into this room, sitting there thinking, who on earth am I going to be sharing with? I won't have it to myself. More about that later as to the chap who came along. But within probably about an hour of me sitting there thinking, crumbs, what goes on now? Here I am on my own. I've never been this far away on my own before. Someone poked his head round the door, which happened to be like a third-year student, and said, "Hi, I'm whatever his name was," and I introduced myself. He said, and he said, "Oh, something like the Yes album, Genesis, cool. You come for a drink?" And I said, well, "Yeah, fine, okay then, yeah." And I went off as this person who just arrived with this group of much older and far more mature, obviously 2 years older or whatever, students. Walked along the River Severn towpath to a pub down the river. Drank copious amounts of beer, because these were obviously very mature and well schooled in the art of drinking beer students. Got absolutely legless.
Yep.
And you know me, John, sick as well probably.
Yes, probably. Yes.
And then walked back along this unfenced towpath along the River Severn,
I'm
deep
hoping
River
you fell
Severn,
in. No?
and finally got back to college. And I look back on it afterwards and think, sadly there are people who have fallen in the River Severn.
Yeah.
It could easily have been me that night, because I was
So
staggering
your
about
new
all over the
friends
place.
didn't walk you home?
No,
Didn't sort of look
they
after
were
the
with
newbie?
me. No, they were with me as
Oh, they
we
were?
walked back.
Okay.
Yeah, but they were used to it, and were quite, and obviously watched, but I didn't fall in. But when I look back on it, I think that could have been my first and only night at the college. Quite easily.
But your first night, you were too drunk to cry in your pillow and
Indeed.
think, I'm missing home.
Totally, absolutely legless that night. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always remember them saying, "Yeah, it's your round. Your feet are knocking." I think it was some phrase like that, which basically meant I hadn't finished my beer.
Oh,
Get a
yeah.
move on, because we're waiting for a round.
Okay.
And I think that most of the money I'd taken with me, probably for at least the term,
Went that first
disappeared the first night. Basically,
I can believe that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I had a sort of similar experience, because when I went up to London, my parents dropped me off and left me. I was very excited. I thought it's a great new adventure. And I went up to my single room in the bed and breakfast place. No heating on, because you had about an hour's heat at night and an hour's heat in the morning. I think that was all through the winter. I met a couple of other guys that night in the place, and we went to the pub round the corner, which had a topless go-go dancer, which was quite interesting, because you don't get a lot of that in West Dorset. And I thought, hey, I'm living in London. This is pretty.
This is
cool.
what happens. This is what happens.
This
in
is
London.
what happens. Yeah. And the house. I mean, I was only there for a few weeks. Because it was expensive, and I didn't have much money, because my grant took a long time to come through, and I had to really sort of penny pinch. But breakfast, the bed. I say it was a bed and breakfast. Breakfast was one boiled egg, and so you would go downstairs and eat that in the company of the other students who were there, the waifs and strays, and then walk the sort of 2 miles to the college.
Wow, yeah. So a real. We both had fairly sort of interesting introductions to our student life then.
Yeah, but I think we embraced it, didn't we? Really, that's the thing. Yeah.
I mean, the next day, I mean, I was obviously hungover as I was wont to be, and eventually in the afternoon, this sort of bespectacled, towser-haired youth appeared at the door and said, "Hey up, lad! You know, I'm your roommate."
He's Welsh then,
obviously.
Yeah.
And he had his parents with him, and he was very sort of well spoken, and I say well spoken, but he introduced himself, and the parents introduced themselves, and he came in and dropped his stuff again, rucksack and a few odd things.
Yeah.
And then the parents went, and this person changed into a sort of a madman once the parents had
I thought
gone.
you were going to say changed into a bikini.
No.
Would have been much more interesting.
Changed into a person who claimed to like S&M rather than M&S. I've got to be honest. It was like
Okay.
nothing like whips, lad. I was thinking, what on earth have I got myself into here? And he'd say something and then finish it off by going, "Oh, laddie," and it was very, very strange. I thought this is not like the genteel people I've left back in Dorset. I've got to be honest.
No.
We sort of tolerated each other eventually. I mean, I thought it was going to be a bit of fun. I got a bit fed up with him in the end. I think he got a bit fed up with me, and we ended up just about tolerating the year together in that room. But he then, he was very rarely in, which was great, and that was nice when he wasn't in, because I had the place to myself, and it was a big room, rather than a small one. So that was the sort of my introduction to sharing a room with someone I'd never met before, which I'd never really done before.
Well, no,
very,
exactly. I mean, that's
very
the thing.
unusual.
Just came straight from home.
Yeah,
didn't
absolutely.
We? We
Yeah.
Did you ever feel homesick?
To be honest, I didn't really. I think once I got into the excitement of this new situation I was in, and surrounded by lots of new people. I mean, not because obviously the roommate was a bit strange, but I soon met people that I got on well with and enjoyed being, and they weren't into S&M. And so we then, quite soon started leading separate existences in the college, and I started to, you graduate towards your chosen gang, don't you? Really?
Did you have to be with him for the whole year then?
Well, we had the room together for a year, but he I don't think he actually lasted the year, if I remember rightly. Certainly he did a couple of terms, and then disappeared, and was often not there anyway. So I often had to myself, which was quite nice. And the last sort of term or so, it was just myself. Nobody else was put in there, so it was quite pleasant, really. But it was a real a strange introduction to it. This peculiar people I'd never met before. But then, as I say, you start to make your own friends, and then I started to play sport and things like that, and you get to know people through that. And of course, the college social life gravitated all towards the bar or the dive, as it was called, in those days, and that was great. That was a great place to meet people and socialise, and I had a table football there and darts and stuff like that, as well as beer. Beer, I think it was 10p a pint at that time. But my grant wasn't very big, so it was a case of most of my savings went on nightly drinking. And I do remember there was I don't know if I've told you this before. There was a beer called Great Northern Bitter.
No.
And Great Northern Bitter was obviously a new sort of brew that came in, and they'd obviously had an agreement with the people who ran the student union bar that if they could put this beer on for a week, they'd do a promotion where with every pint of beer that you bought, you'd get a token. And once you'd got, I think it was 4 tokens of the, so you'd get anybody else's who didn't want them, you got a free pint.
Right.
And I can remember the one night in there. I mean, it obviously can't have been very strong stuff because nobody got hammered on it, but we drank loads and loads of this beer.
Mm.
It was horrendous. It never came back again because it was awful stuff.
Yeah.
It had no real taste to it. We talked about thin beer you could see through.
Yes.
And this really was a watery, thin beer that you could see through. I think they thought they'd stop the students drinking too much by putting this stuff on.
Yeah.
It never came back. It wasn't very successful. And I've never heard of it since.
No, no. No, I wasn't homesick myself because I very quickly made friends, and I loved the fact that I was in London. With all the opportunities that London had, particularly all the pubs and the gigs I could go to, and of course, I knew Jackie, and she was working, and so I got to go to many gigs with her that she would get free tickets for. But I was quite hard up. Because I think because my dad being self-employed, his accountant had to okay his figures before they could release them to, and then they wouldn't let my grant come to them. I didn't get my grant till just before Christmas. Yeah. So I really did have to scrimp and save a bit.
I still have somewhere the stub from the check of my grant check that I picked up from and I went followed in all the people who were picking up their full grants as it was at the time, and once Dorset County Council had looked at my dad's wages, my mum's wages, all that sort of stuff, which because they knew what they were. I picked up a cheque for £1.17.
Really? Okay.
Which didn't go very far. In fact, I think it went that night in the.
I think the
bar.
grant in those days was about £650 for the year. The student grant. And I had some, but my parents had to make up the rest.
I had to have handouts, obviously. And stuff I'd earned working on the grain dryer in Melplush Court Farm. So, Yeah.
So I was in Mr. Kidwai's place for several weeks, and I soon discovered that the college that I'd gone to was a very politically radical place.
Oh right, okay.
And. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, the director had previously worked in Rhodesia before it became Zimbabwe. So he was not tolerated by the various members of the extreme left who formed the college, student union, and so within about a week of my being at the Polytechnic, I found myself in the director's office, but the director wasn't there. In fact, there were about 50 students there because we had occupied his office.
You reactionaries, you!
And were drinking his sherry. It was an interesting situation. I can't really remember the end of that story, but he eventually left, I think. But he was very unpopular when he was there. But we couldn't stay in the bed and breakfast place, partly because I couldn't afford it. So I knew we had to find a flat, and I started looking for a flat with my friend Robert, who was on the same course as me. And we eventually found a place. We needed a third person to move in immediately, and the only person I could see in the college canteen that day was Steve, who had a room in Mr. Kidwai's place that had never had a door.
Okay.
I don't think he was charged any less for it, but it was he had no bedroom door. No. Anyway, we all moved in just before Christmas, I think, or no, maybe just after Christmas. But anyway.
Did you have a canteen at your?
Yes, we did.
College? Yeah.
Yes,
we had one, and it was. I think it was probably very good. But to be honest, I was a bit of a fussy eater at the time, and I think my first year at college, certainly, I lived on toast with beans and cheese.
Yes.
Because I looked at things. Oh, I don't like the look of that. And I look back and think, you fussy idiot. Why didn't you just eat stuff? Yeah. I think I was like, oh, it's not like my mum's home cooking, that sort of thing. And I lived on this, and because I was living on toast, beans, and cheese, I got a lot of sore throats, a lot of wind, I would imagine, as well.
That's never left you, has it? Really?
And certainly didn't put any weight on because I wasn't eating enough to do that, really.
No, drinking enough. You should have.
Drinking enough, yeah.
Well, of course, I mean, because I was in a bed and breakfast place, we just had to go out to eat every evening.
Yeah.
So we would go out to the cheapest cafe we could find, and so I didn't eat very well either. You know, you eat in the canteen at lunchtime, but
yes, a treat. I remember a treat for us was if you could afford it, you would go to a Chinese restaurant in the middle of Worcester where they used to do businessmen's lunches, as they called them, and they were like a certain deal you could have, and it would be like a bowl of soup and one dish and like a banana fritter or something like that. And it certainly filled us up eventually because, you know, I was quite happy to go and have that, but I didn't want the stuff in the canteen, which had been paid for, which is ridiculous, you know.
Oh, that was included.
I didn't have to pay for that, and there I was spending my money on food when actually I should have been eating the food in the canteen. Yeah. Now you're saying about, you know, the falling out between the right and the left in your college. The only real falling out we had at college was between the students and what we called the townies. Because you didn't see much of them because where the college was a little way out of the city of Worcester, and you would only really see them if you had a concert on at the college, because there'd be a band on they'd like to see, and they were allowed to come and buy tickets. I've got a feeling if they couldn't produce their students' union card, it was a bit more expensive, or quite a bit more expensive for them. And of course there was also that underlying current of I suppose aggression and resentment towards the students who were getting this. So we never had any brawls or fights, but you knew that it was always on the edge quite often. I think they thought to themselves, well, if we do that, if they get a really good band, we won't be able to come and see them. So it was just kept bubbling under all the time, really. In that way.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we used to get bands at the college, but then being in North London, as I said, it was the era of pub rock, and so you would just go down to the pub and they maybe put a penny on a pint of beer for that night.
Yes.
But you get to see, you know, great sort of pub rock bands like Ace Ducks Deluxe and you know, Brinsley Schwartz and you know, all sorts of people like that.
I mean, we were a small college. And when I eventually got onto what they called the Dance and Disco Committee, I used to see the price lists of the bands that you could get, and of course all the ones you really wanted were way out of our price range because we weren't like a big university, and you'd end up having you'd have a good night, but it was certainly with a second division band most of the time.
I know.
So it wasn't really the top ones that would come.
No.
The education side of it.
Yes, well, I suppose we ought to cover that, really, haven't we? We talked about this. You know, we were students, so we were supposed to be learning something.
I was doing the education courses and main subject courses, that sort of thing. I had a great first year. It was, and so, as I say, socially it was fantastic. Now the problem was that because I was having such a great social time, and I would often have a hangover in the morning, and sometimes I wouldn't make the morning lectures because I didn't feel like it, I felt ill. Eventually I started getting little notes in my pigeonhole from lecturers saying, you know, dear David, where were you? Missed you at the time. Which I ignored, which I often ignored. I thought, oh no, it's one or two, it'll be fine. Until at the very end of that first year, when I was thinking, this is great, I'm really enjoying this. It's a great place to be. I had a note in my pigeonhole from the vice principal, and it said, please come to see me in my office. And I went along, reasonably okay, thinking, I wonder what this is all about, sort of thing. And then I knocked on the door, and he called me in, and he really was one of these people who had quite a high chair behind his desk and a lower chair in front of it that you sat on, so he could look down at you. And I can remember his words were, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but his words were something along the lines of, well, David, you've had a lovely sociable first year, haven't you? And I said, yes, I have, thank you very much. He said, now, let me be honest with you, he said. I've seen that you've had notes from lecturers, you've missed some lectures, you haven't always done work of the standard we're really expecting. You have a choice to make. Now you can either say to yourself, I've had a fantastic year
Mhm.
and that's it,
Mm-hmm.
or you can promise me that next year you will knuckle down and
Mm-hmm.
actually do some work. Otherwise, your place at this college will be terminated.
Oh, right. Oh,
And that
a
was
real threat
it was a
then.
real, cut off here.
Mm.
And yeah, obviously I then trembled and yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir.
Mhm.
Left that office and I thought I've got to do something about this. And I actually did go back. I mean, we'll
Mhm.
come to the second year in a minute, but as you can tell, I did do something about it. And,
Obviously, you
and
knuckled down.
I knuckled down and
Yeah.
thought, yeah, that's been great, but I need to settle down now and actually do some work.
I don't suppose
which
your
I did.
parents ever got news of that, did
No,
they?
no,
I mean,
no.
that's the
Oh,
interesting thing,
no.
the difference from school, wasn't it? That you
Yes,
didn't have to go
yeah,
to lectures, and you could miss them.
Well,
Um,
not in the teacher training college I was in. You were expected
Oh,
to go
yeah.
to all the lectures, really.
Okay, yeah. Did you ever have to do any teaching in the first year, or teaching? Practice?
Yes. I had to do a teaching practice in the first year, which again was great because it was a little village school, which is there no longer,
Mhm.
out in near Wolverhampton,
Mm-hmm.
and 2 of us were sent to have bed and breakfast, if you like, at a house where
Yeah.
they put up student teachers, and this woman would provide us with enormous meals. Myself and a lad called Nick, I remember, and enormous meals where we'd force our way through them, even though far too much for us, and then we'd do whatever work we had to do, and then go to the pub in the evening. So again, it was part of the sort of social first year, really.
You were
It didn't-
actually teaching.
I was actually teaching, yes. I mean, I
Mm.
certainly couldn't get drunk and miss a day because it was part of my teaching practice. But
Yeah.
and that went very well. I mean, I quite enjoyed it, and it made me think, maybe I should knuckle down because I've quite enjoyed this. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, educationally for me, I mean, I was doing a split course, which was English and history and philosophy.
Okay.
And philosophy was new to me, although I had a sort of an interest in it from things I read in the past, and it was fairly baffling. But I would say I actually enjoyed the studies, and
Yes,
and
yeah.
it was not taxing. I don't know how full a day you used to have, but I might have 2 or 3 lectures in a day, maybe for an hour.
Yeah.
So and the rest of the time you spent in the bar playing table football or darts.
Yeah.
And no compulsion to get up early. It was a pretty easy life.
I have to say that the life of a student teacher was, I mean, I'm going to say was considerably more wearing and taxing than that, because our lectures started at 9.
Okay.
You had to be there. You had a break mid-morning for a quick sort of it was an egg and cress sandwich, if I remember rightly, and a cup of coffee. Back in for lectures up to lunchtime. We had about an hour and a
really?
half for lunch, which wasn't too bad. Back in the afternoon.
Oh, that's a lot more serious, isn't it? And every day
quick-
was like that.
5 days a week was like that, yes, and
Okay.
then right the way through till probably about 4:30 or something like that. So it was a full-on day, which is
Yeah.
why, of course, when I'd got hungover, sometimes I thought, I can't be there for 9 o'clock. There's no way I'm going to make it. So
No.
that's why that tended to happen then. It improved in the second year, and I just knuckled down, as I say. So
I remember some of the lectures being very, very good, and some of them being very, very poor. I can remember quite a sort of a demeaning thing. I think he was an English lecturer teaching Hardy, I think, and he raised the question. It was a big sort of group of us. It must have been about maybe 60, 70 students, and he said, what's changed, over the last, 100 years since Hardy was writing. And I put my hand up and I said, an erosion of social status or something like that. And he said, God, where have you been living? And I thought that was, I was crushed by that. I was quite a put down.
the trouble is you don't want to speak again, then, do you?
Well, no, you don't really. No. So, I was 18, but I felt like I was about 8, actually.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I mean, the education was pretty good, and you didn't have to do that much work. Had a lot of reading to do. Did you have a lot of reading to do?
Not a huge amount. No, I mean there were some books that were recommended. A few books were recommended, and you sort of bought those cheaply from students who'd used them before.
Yeah.
And I used to flick through them quite idly. And the worst ones for me were the education books because I just found them so boring.
Yeah.
They had no oomph in them at all, and they were hard work to
Yeah.
work your way through. And I'm not sure I completely absorbed everything they were trying to tell me in them anyway. And you ended up making up your own mind about certain things.
Yeah.
But no, I mean there wasn't a lot of literature to read. Certainly, it was more sort of background stuff really.
Join us for part 2 of our musings soon.